Imagine you're a good person. You've never hurt anyone. You help your neighbors, you donate to charity, you consider yourself kind and reasonable. Now imagine someone hands you a uniform, a badge, and a wooden baton. They tell you you're in charge of a group of strangers locked in a basement. Within just 2 days, you're shouting at these people, humiliating them, waking them up in the middle of the night for no reason. Within 6 days, the experiment has to be shut down because of how cruel you've become. This isn't a horror movie. This actually happened in the summer of 1971 at one of America's most prestigious universities. It was called the Stanford Prison Experiment, and what it revealed about human nature is so disturbing that we're still talking about it over 50 years later. The question it forces us to confront is this: are we all just one uniform away from becoming monsters? Or is there something deeper happening when we're given power over others? Today, we're diving into one of psychology's most infamous experiments to understand why power corrupts, how situations can override our personalities, and what this means for your life right now in the real world. In the sweltering August of 1971, a young psychology professor at Stanford University named Philip Zimbardo had a controversial idea. He wanted to understand what happens to people when they're placed in positions of power or powerlessness, not through surveys or interviews, but through direct experience. He wanted to create a prison right there in the basement of the psychology building and see what ordinary people would do when assigned the roles of guards and prisoners. Zimbardo placed an ad in the local newspaper offering $15 a day for male volunteers to participate in a psychological study of prison life. He received dozens of applications. After extensive screening interviews and personality tests, he selected 24 college students. These weren't troubled individuals or people with violent tendencies. They were normal, emotionally stable, middle-class young men. Most were college students. They had no criminal records, no history of psychological problems, no signs of aggression or antisocial behavior. Then came the random assignment. With a simple coin flip, half became prisoners and half became guards. Think about that for a moment. A random flip of a coin determined whether you would spend the next 2 weeks with power or without it. The prisoners were told to wait at home. On a Sunday morning, they were arrested by real Palo Alto police officers who charged them with armed robbery, read them their rights, handcuffed them, and drove them to the station for processing. They were fingerprinted, photographed, and then blindfolded and driven to Stanford's psychology department. When the blindfolds came off, they found themselves in a makeshift prison. Regular university hallway transformed with barred doors. They were stripped, searched, deloused, given a uniform that was really just a smock with an identification number, and a chain was locked around one ankle. From that moment on, they were no longer people with names. They were numbers. Prisoner 8612, Prisoner 819. The guards received khaki uniforms, whistles, wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses that prevented anyone from seeing their eyes or reading their emotions. Zimbardo gave them minimal instructions. He told them to maintain order and respect, but never told them how. He explicitly said they could not use physical violence, but beyond that, they had almost complete freedom to run their prison however they wanted. Zimbardo expected the study to last 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. What happened in that basement defied everyone's expectations, including Zimbardo's. Let's walk through it day by day, because the speed of the transformation is crucial to understanding why this experiment shook the foundations of psychology. On day 1, everyone was still finding their footing. The guards seemed almost awkward in their roles, uncertain about what to do. The prisoners were mostly treating it like an interesting social experiment, something to tell stories about later. But by the second day, something shifted. The prisoners staged a rebellion. They ripped off their identification numbers, barricaded themselves in their cells using their beds, and began taunting the guards. Now here's where it gets fascinating. The guards didn't report this to Zimbardo as a problem to solve together. Instead, they took it personally. They called in the guards from other shifts, even though they were off duty. Together, they devised a strategy to break the rebellion. They used fire extinguishers to force prisoners away from the doors. They stripped the prisoners naked. They took away their beds. They created a privileged cell where compliant prisoners got better treatment, then mixed up who was in that cell to breed distrust and break down prisoner solidarity. Think about this carefully. These were college students who, just 48 hours earlier, had been ordinary people living ordinary lives. They hadn't been trained in prison management. They hadn't been told to be creative with punishment. They invented these psychological tactics on their own because they felt their authority had been challenged. Over the next few days, the situation escalated rapidly. Guards began to wake prisoners in the middle of the night for counts that could last hours. They forced them to do push-ups, sometimes with a guard's foot on their back. They made prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands. They denied them food. They took away bathroom privileges, forcing prisoners to urinate in buckets that were left in their cells. One guard earned the nickname John Wayne because of how aggressively he embodied the role, inventing increasingly humiliating punishments seemingly for his own entertainment. Meanwhile, the prisoners were breaking down psychologically. One prisoner, number 8612, began suffering from acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage after just 36 hours. Zimbardo thought he was faking it to get released, but when Zimbardo told him he couldn't leave, the prisoner's response was telling. He didn't say, "This is just an experiment, I'm leaving anyway." He went back to the other prisoners and said, "You can't leave, you can't get out." Let that sink in. In less than 2 days, a Stanford student had internalized his role so completely that he forgot he was in a voluntary experiment. The prison had become his reality. 4 more prisoners had to be released early due to extreme emotional distress. One developed a psychosomatic rash all over his body. Another went on a hunger strike and was put in solitary confinement, a closet so small he could barely move, where other prisoners were told to call him a bad prisoner for refusing to eat. The remaining prisoners became increasingly passive, obedient, and emotionally broken. They talked about other prisoners in ways that dehumanized them. They sided with the guards against fellow prisoners to gain favor. And here's perhaps the most disturbing part. Zimbardo himself got lost in the role. He wasn't just observing the experiment. He had designated himself as the prison superintendent. When a prisoner's mother came to visit and complained about the conditions, Zimbardo found himself defending the guards and worrying about whether prisoners might try to escape. When his girlfriend, Christina Maslach, a recent psychology PhD, visited the basement and saw prisoners being marched to the bathroom with bags over their heads in chains, she was horrified. She confronted Zimbardo, asking him what he had become and how he could allow this to continue. It was only her outside perspective, someone who hadn't been gradually immersed in the situation, that snapped Zimbardo back to reality. He shut down the experiment on day 6. Of the 50 or so people who had observed the experiment over those 6 days, psychologists, graduate students, consultants, Christina Maslach was the only one who seriously questioned its morality. So what happened here? How did a random group of college students transform into brutal guards and broken prisoners in less than a week? This is where we get to the heart of why power corrupts. Zimbardo's explanation centers on something called situational forces. We like to believe that our behavior comes from who we are inside, from our character, our values, our personality. We think of ourselves as fundamentally good or bad people, and we believe we would never do terrible things because we're not terrible people. But Zimbardo's experiment suggests that situation often overpowers personality. When you place good people in a bad system, the system wins. The guards weren't sadistic before the experiment. They were randomly assigned to that role. But the situation gave them certain things that transformed their behavior. It gave them power over others. It gave them anonymity through those mirrored sunglasses, so they couldn't be identified individually and didn't have to face the humanity reflected in the prisoner's eyes. It gave them a role with clear in-groups and out-groups. It gave them an institution that implicitly sanctioned their behavior by not stopping it. Perhaps most importantly, it gave them a gradual escalation, where each day's cruelty became the baseline for the next day's normal. This concept, that situations can make good people do bad things, has a name in psychology. It's called the Lucifer effect, which Zimbardo later used as the title for his book about the experiment. The idea is that evil isn't something that happens because monsters exist in the world. Evil emerges when ordinary people are placed in corrupting situations. The devil isn't a being you're born as. It's a transformation that happens when circumstances align. Now you might be thinking, okay, but I'm never going to be a prison guard. This doesn't apply to me. But here's the thing. You don't need to be in a prison for these principles to shape your life. The dynamics that played out in that Stanford basement play out every single day in offices, in schools, in online communities, in families, and in your own mind. Think about workplace hierarchies. How many managers have you encountered who seemed reasonable when they were your peer, but became demanding, dismissive, or even cruel once they got promoted? They didn't suddenly become bad people. The situation changed. They were given power. They were separated from the people they now managed by an organizational structure, and slowly the empathy that comes from seeing people as equals eroded. They started seeing employees as resources to be managed rather than humans to be respected. Or consider social media. When you're behind a screen with an anonymous username, when you're part of a mob dunking on someone, when the platform's design encourages engagement through outrage, ordinary people say things they would never say face to face. The anonymity, the distance, the group behavior, these are the same situational forces that operated in the Stanford prison. You're not a bad person, but the situation has removed the normal constraints on cruelty. Look at institutional abuse that keeps making headlines, elder abuse in nursing homes, hazing rituals in fraternities, abuse scandals in religious organizations or youth programs. In almost every case, people are shocked that seemingly normal individuals participated in or ignored terrible behavior. But these institutions create the same conditions: power imbalances, closed systems with little outside oversight, gradual normalization of boundary violations, strong in-group loyalty that discourages whistleblowing. The Stanford Prison Experiment teaches us that we need to be vigilant about the situations we enter and the roles we adopt. When you find yourself with power over others, whether as a manager, a teacher, a parent, or even just someone with a platform online, you need to actively work against the corrupting influence of that power. You need to maintain your empathy. You need to stay connected to the humanity of the people you have power over. You need to invite outside perspectives that can check your behavior before you normalize cruelty. But it also teaches us something about being the prisoner, being the person without power. Those Stanford prisoners internalized their roles terrifyingly fast. They began to see themselves through the lens of their oppressors. They turned on each other. They forgot they could leave. This happens in abusive relationships, in toxic workplaces, in oppressive political systems. When you're systematically stripped of power and autonomy, it becomes psychologically difficult to remember that you have agency, that you can resist, that you can leave. Understanding the Stanford Prison Experiment means recognizing when you're in a corrupting situation, whether you're the guard or the prisoner, and taking conscious steps to resist its influence. It means questioning authority and systems, even when, especially when, you're the one benefiting from them. It means speaking up like Christina Maslach did, even when everyone else has accepted the abnormal as normal. The Stanford Prison Experiment revealed an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We are not as consistent as we think we are. The person you are in one situation might be unrecognizable in another. Your character is not a fixed trait, but something that must be actively maintained against situational pressures that can warp it. Power doesn't just corrupt. Power reveals. It reveals how fragile our ethics are when they're not reinforced by external constraints. It reveals how quickly we can dehumanize others when systems encourage it. It reveals how susceptible we all are to roles and situations. But here's the empowering flip side. If situations can make us worse, they can also make us better. If we're vulnerable to corrupting systems, we can also consciously design situations and systems that bring out our best selves. We can build accountability into power structures. We can maintain connections across hierarchies. We can encourage dissent and outside perspectives. We can recognize the early signs of dehumanization and consciously resist them. The question isn't whether you would have been a brutal guard or a broken prisoner in that basement at Stanford. The question is, what situations are you in right now that might be slowly corrupting you? What small cruelties have you normalized? What power imbalances have you stopped questioning? And most importantly, what are you going to do about it? Because the lesson of the Stanford Prison Experiment isn't that we're all monsters waiting to be unleashed. It's that we're all vulnerable, and only by recognizing that vulnerability can we protect ourselves and others from the situations that bring out our worst. So here's your reflection question. Think about a time when you had power over someone else, even in a small way. Maybe as a senior employee training a junior colleague, maybe as an older sibling, maybe just as someone with more social status in a friend group. Did you notice any change in how you thought about that person or treated them? Did having power, even a little bit, change you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it honestly, because the first step to resisting the Lucifer effect is admitting we're all susceptible to it. Thanks for watching. If this made you think differently about power, human nature, or your own behavior, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into psychology and philosophy that actually matter for your life. And remember, we're not prisoners of our situations, but only if we stay aware of how situations can imprison us.